The air inside the terminal felt heavy and artificial. Mei Lin stared through the massive windows as workers loaded luggage into the belly of the plane that would carry her across the Pacific. Her hands were clammy, her stomach in knots. At 26, she'd managed to avoid flying her entire life. But some things were more powerful than fear, like family. 3 days ago, she'd received the call that her grandmother in Taipei had suffered a stroke. The doctors weren't sure how long she had left, so here Mei Lin stood, clutching her boarding pass for Pacific Airlines Flight 437, like it was both a lifeline and a death sentence. Final boarding call for passengers on Flight 437 to Taipei. The announcement cut through her thoughts. Mei Lin took a deep breath, picked up her carry-on bag, and joined the short line of stragglers making their way down the jetway. The smell hit her first, recycled air with hints of cleaning solution. Then came the claustrophobia as she shuffled down the narrow aisle, trying to avoid eye contact with already seated passengers. Row 27, seats D, E, and F. Mei Lin checked her boarding pass again. Seat E, the middle seat. Perfect. Trapped between strangers for 12 hours. She spotted her row and an older man with silver hair and kind eyes sitting in the window seat. He nodded as she approached. "Excuse me," she mumbled, sliding past to reach the middle. The aisle seat remained empty for now. Mei Lin buckled herself in, the click of the metal sounding unnaturally loud to her ears. Her fingers immediately found the armrests, gripping them so tightly her knuckles whitened. She tried to control her breathing the way her therapist had taught her years ago, but it wasn't working. "First flight?" the older man asked, his voice gentle. Mei Lin nodded, not trusting her voice. "Well, you picked a good airline and a good plane. This 787 is one of the safest aircraft ever built." She wanted to tell him that wasn't helpful. She knew the statistics and they did nothing to calm the irrational part of her brain, currently imagining 1,000 different disaster scenarios. Instead, she managed a weak smile. "I'm Joe," he said. "Mei Lin," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. A businesswoman in a wrinkled suit claimed the aisle seat, nodding curtly before putting on headphones and opening her laptop. At least, Mei Lin wouldn't have to make small talk with her. The cabin door closed with a heavy thunk that made Mei Lin flinch. A flight attendant began the safety demonstration, pointing out exits Mei Lin had already memorized from studying the safety card with an intensity usually reserved for final exams. "You know," Joe said quietly, "I used to fly these routes for 30 years. Retired pilot." This caught Mei Lin's attention. "You were a pilot?" He nodded. "Commercial, mostly trans-Pacific routes like this one. And you never had any problems?" she asked, knowing how stupid the question sounded even as it left her mouth. Joe chuckled. "Oh, we had our share of bumps, weather, mechanical quirks, the occasional unruly passenger, nothing the planes and crew couldn't handle." The aircraft began to push back from the gate. Mei Lin's grip tightened even more. "Breathe through your nose," Joe advised. "Slow and steady." She tried, focusing on her breath, rather than the movement of the plane as it taxied toward the runway. "I studied engineering in college," she blurted out, needing distraction. "Oh, what kind?" "Aerospace, actually. For 3 years before I switched to mechanical." Joe's eyebrows rose. "Now that's ironic." The plane stopped at the end of the runway. Mei Lin knew what came next. She'd watched enough videos trying to prepare herself for this moment. The engines would power up, pushing them down the runway until they reached takeoff speed. "It helps some people to understand what's happening," Joe said, sensing her rising panic. "Right now the pilots are getting final clearance from the tower." As if on cue, the engines began to roar, and the plane started moving forward, gradually, picking up speed. "They're watching their instruments, waiting for the right moment," Joe continued. "When we hit about 170 miles per hour, depending on our weight, the nose will lift." The force pushed Mei Lin back into her seat. The vibrations from the runway traveled through the floor, up her legs into her chest. She closed her eyes. "And now we're rotating," Joe narrated calmly. "Feel that? We're airborne." Mei Lin's stomach dropped as the plane left the ground. Her ears popped with the pressure change. The landing gear is retracting, Joe continued. Listen for the thump as the wheels tuck away. The sound came just as he predicted. Now we're climbing to our cruising altitude of about 35,000 feet. That'll take around 20 minutes. Mei Lin opened her eyes slowly. Joe was looking out the window, but turned back to her with an encouraging smile. The view is quite something if you want to look. Maybe later, she managed, though the tight band of anxiety around her chest had loosened slightly. So, aerospace engineering, Joe said. What made you switch? Mei Lin rarely talked about this, but something about the strange intimacy of being trapped next to a stranger at 10,000 feet and climbing made her willing to share. My uncle died in a small plane crash when I was 19. He was a hobbyist pilot. After that, I couldn't imagine spending my career designing things that fly. I'm sorry to hear that, Joe said. That must have been very hard. Mei Lin nodded. The thing is, I love the coursework. I was good at it too. Understanding how forces work, how materials respond to stress, how systems integrate. She shook her head. But every time we discussed safety factors or failure scenarios, I would see his face. The plane banked slightly to the right, and Mei Lin's hand shot out to grip the armrest again. That's normal, Joe assured her. We're just adjusting course. Think of it like changing lanes on a highway. The comparison helped, strangely enough. So mechanical engineering seemed safer? Exactly. Buildings, bridges, manufacturing equipment, things that stay firmly on the ground. Mei Lin smiled slightly. Though honestly, the principles aren't that different. They're not, Joe agreed. It's all about understanding forces and designing systems that can handle them safely. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off. Around them, passengers began to move, retrieving items from bags, heading to the restrooms, stretching in the aisles. The businesswoman beside Mei Lin immediately unbuckled and headed toward the back of the plane. Can I ask you something technical? Mei Lin said, finding that talking about engineering principles calmed her more than anything else had. How much redundancy is built into these flight systems? Joe's eyes lit up. Oh, these modern planes are marvels of backup systems. Take the 787 we're on right now. It has multiple hydraulic systems, each capable of controlling the aircraft independently, if others fail. The electrical system has main generators, backup generators, a ram air turbine for emergency power, and batteries beyond that. What about the flight computers? Triple redundant at minimum. Some systems have even more backups. They constantly check each other, and if one disagrees with the others, it gets outvoted. Mei Lin found herself genuinely interested, momentarily forgetting her fear. That's fascinating. In my senior design project, we were working on fail-safe mechanisms for automated manufacturing systems, and we used a similar voting protocol. For the next 20 minutes, they discussed engineering principles, redundant systems, and the elegant solutions aircraft designers had developed over decades. Joe explained how the composite materials in the 787's wings allowed them to flex more than metal wings could, providing a smoother ride in turbulence. When the flight attendants came by with drink service, Mei Lin realized with surprise that she'd gone almost an hour without checking the seatbelt sign or gripping the armrests. She accepted a ginger ale and even dared a glance out the window as Joe pointed out Mount Rainier in the distance. It's beautiful, she admitted, taking in the snow-capped peak rising above a blanket of clouds. I've hiked there, but never seen it from this angle. That's the thing about flying, Joe said. It gives you perspective you can't get any other way. As Mei Lin sipped her drink and continued chatting with Joe about the mountain ranges below, she felt a small victory. She was still nervous, still counting the hours until they would land in Taipei, but the paralyzing fear had subsided into something manageable. The flight attendant returned to collect their empty cups. Everything okay here? Yes, Mei Lin said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Everything's okay. Joe smiled knowingly and returned to gazing out the window as the plane continued its journey westward, carrying Mei Lin across an ocean of both water and fear toward the grandmother, who needed her. 3 hours into the flight, Mei Lin awoke with a start. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. After her conversation with Joe, she'd felt calm enough to close her eyes for just a moment while listening to a meditation app on her phone. That moment had apparently stretched into hours. The cabin lights were dimmed. Many passengers had pulled their window shades down, creating an artificial night despite the bright sunshine that Mei Lin knew must be outside. The businesswoman in the aisle seat was typing on her laptop, the blue glow of the screen illuminating her focused expression. Joe was reading a paperback thriller, a small overhead light creating a pool of yellow around his seat. He noticed Mei Lin stirring and smiled. "Good nap?" he asked. Mei Lin nodded, but something felt off. She couldn't place it at first, a subtle difference in the background noise perhaps. She tilted her head, listening carefully. "Do you hear that?" she asked Joe. He looked up from his book. "Hear what?" "The engine sound. It's different." She hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "It's probably nothing." Joe closed his book and listened for a moment. Maybe a slight vibration? Could just be turbulence ahead." Mei Lin shook her head. "It's not that, it's the pitch of the right engine. It's higher than before, and there's an irregular pattern to it." Her engineering mind was already analyzing the sound, breaking it down into potential causes. "Like something's not spinning quite right." Joe raised his eyebrows, impressed. "You've got a good ear." He tilted his head, listening more carefully. "You might be right, but modern engines have multiple monitoring systems. If there's an issue, the flight crew already knows." Mei Lin nodded, trying to reassure herself. She checked the flight map on her screen. They were over the Pacific Ocean, far from land in any direction. Not the best place for engine trouble. "I'm going to stretch my legs," she said, needing to move to dispel her growing anxiety. The businesswoman sighed but stood to let Mei Lin out. Walking the narrow aisle, Mei Lin noticed a flight attendant at the back galley checking something on a tablet, her brow furrowed. Another flight attendant hurried past, moving toward the front of the plane. Their faces looked tense, their customer service smiles momentarily absent. Mei Lin used the lavatory and washed her hands, studying her reflection in the mirror. "You're being paranoid," she whispered to herself. "This is why you avoided flying for so long." But when she returned to her seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The vibration had become more noticeable, a subtle shudder running through the plane every 30 seconds or so. Joe had been watching for her return. "You felt it too?" he asked quietly. Mei Lin nodded. "What do you think it is?" "Could be several things. Might be an imbalance in one of the turbine fans. Could be a bearing issue. Might even be something as simple as the automated system adjusting thrust to compensate for changing air conditions." None of those explanations fully convinced her. Mei Lin's mind raced through the aircraft systems she'd studied years ago. The engines were incredibly complex, with thousands of parts working in precise harmony. Even small issues could cascade if not addressed. "Shouldn't they make an announcement or something?" she asked. "They will if it's necessary. Right now, they're probably running diagnostics, communicating with maintenance teams on the ground." Mei Lin tried to distract herself by watching a movie, but she couldn't focus on the plot. Instead, her attention kept drifting to the sounds around her, the subtle changes in the aircraft's movement, the expressions of passing crew members. Another hour passed. The vibration grew more pronounced. Mei Lin noticed more flight attendants, moving purposefully through the cabin, checking seatbelts, securing loose items in the galleys. One of them spoke quietly into a handset at a crew station, her face serious. "Something's definitely happening," Mei Lin whispered to Joe. Before he could answer, the captain's voice came over the intercom. His tone was professional, but Mei Lin detected the slight edge of tension beneath the calm words. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties with one of our engines. As a precautionary measure, we'll be diverting to Midway Island, where we'll land and have our mechanics take a look. We expect to be on the ground in about 40 minutes. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants will be coming through the cabin to collect any loose items and prepare for landing." The cabin immediately filled with murmurs. Passengers exchanged glances, some looking frightened, others merely annoyed at the delay. "Midway Island?" Maylin asked Joe. "Is that normal?" Joe's expression had grown serious. "It's an emergency landing, strip, rarely used for commercial flights these days." He kept his voice low. "If we're diverting there, the issue is more serious than they're letting on." The businesswoman beside them closed her laptop. "Are we in danger?" she asked, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. No, Joe assured her. "They're being cautious. That's a good thing. Better to check things on the ground than push on." But Maylin noticed how his eyes tracked every movement of the crew, how he kept glancing out the window at the right. Kenjin. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, their training evident in their calm but thorough actions. They checked seatbelts, made sure tray tables were stowed, and instructed passengers to keep their shoes on. Several people asked questions, but the answers were brief and carefully phrased to avoid causing panic. "Has this happened to you before?" Maylin asked Joe. "When you were flying?" He nodded. "A few times. Engines are complicated machines, things happen. But that's why there are protocols, why we train for these scenarios." He patted her hand. "Trust the crew." Maylin tried, but the engineer in her couldn't stop analyzing. The vibration pattern had changed again, becoming more erratic. The plane was descending more rapidly than seemed normal, even for an emergency landing, and she noticed they were flying at a slight angle, as if the pilots were compensating for something. A flight attendant paused at their row, her practiced smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Everything okay here?" "Yes, thank you," Joe answered. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "How bad is it, really?" The flight attendant hesitated, her professional mask slipping for just a moment. "Just follow all instructions promptly," she said quietly before moving on. Joe's expression darkened. "That's flight attendant code for be ready," he murmured. The plane banked slightly, changing course. Through the windows on the opposite side, Maylin could see they were descending through cloud cover. The vibration intensified. Suddenly, the lights in the cabin flickered. Once, twice. Several passengers gasped. The entertainment systems went dark, then rebooted. A soft electronic chime sounded from the cockpit, not the usual tone Maylin had heard before. "That's not good," Joe said, his voice tight. "Electrical system fluctuation." Maylin's heart pounded. Her palms grew sweaty. All the disaster scenarios she had imagined before boarding now seemed terrifyingly possible. She looked around at her fellow passengers. A mother clutched her young son's hand. An elderly couple whispered prayers. The businesswoman had pulled out a photo from her wallet and was staring at it intensely. "Joe," Maylin said quietly, "if this is related to the engine issue, what could be happening? Specifically?" He hesitated, clearly debating how much to tell her. "Best guess? We've lost partial power from the affected engine, maybe generator. Issues affecting the electrical systems. They're trying to compensate, but something's not responding as expected." The cabin lights flickered again, this time staying off for several seconds before emergency lighting activated. The captain's voice returned, noticeably more urgent. "Cabin crew, prepare for immediate landing, that was it. No reassurance for the passengers, no update on their status. Just 5 words that sent a chill through the cabin." "That's not the full brace command," Joe explained quickly, seeing Maylin's panic. "We're not crashing, but things have escalated." Lynn felt the plane descend more sharply. The oxygen masks suddenly dropped from the ceiling compartments, dangling on their yellow tubes. Screams erupted throughout the cabin. "Depressurization," Joe said, reaching for his mask. "Put yours on quickly." Maylin's hands shook as she pulled the mask over her face, tightening the elastic band as she'd been instructed during the safety demonstration. The strange sensation of breathing pure oxygen made her lightheaded, or perhaps that was the fear. Through the window, she could now see the ocean below, vast and empty in all directions. No sign of Midway Island or any landmass. Just water. Flight attendants struggled to maintain balance as she moved up the aisle, checking that everyone had their masks on properly. The plane lurched, sending her sprawling across a row of seats. "Joe," Maylin said, her voice muffled by the mask. "I don't think we're going to make it to Midway." He didn't contradict her. Instead, he reached across and squeezed her hand. The first officer emerged from the cockpit, steadying himself against the cabin wall as the plane continued its uneven descent. His face was ashen beneath his oxygen mask, his uniform shirt dark with sweat. "Is there anyone with flight experience on board?" He called out, his voice carrying despite the mask. Joe immediately raised his hand. "Former commercial pilot, 30 years experience," he called back. The first officer moved toward them. As he approached, Maylin could see the barely controlled panic in his eyes. "Sir, we need your assistance in the cockpit," he said to Joe. "Immediately." Joe unbuckled his seatbelt, but then paused, turning to Maylin. "You should come too," he said. "Me?" she replied, stunned. "Why?" "Because you heard the problem before anyone else did. Because you understand aircraft systems." His eyes held hers. "And because I think we're going to need all the help we can get." Maylin hesitated, frozen in her seat as Joe's words sank in. The first officer was already helping Joe into the aisle, both men struggling to keep their balance as the plane continued its unsteady descent. "I'm not a pilot," she protested, her voice thin with fear beneath the oxygen mask. "I don't even like flying." Joe leaned down, his eyes serious above his mask. "You noticed the engine issue before any of the passengers, maybe before the pilots did. You understand these systems? So, right now that might be more valuable than flight hours." The businesswoman beside them stared in disbelief. "You're taking her to the cockpit. She's been terrified since takeoff. Sometimes the people most afraid are the most careful," Joe replied. He extended his hand to Maylin. "We need to go now." Heart hammering against her ribs, Maylin unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The plane lurched, nearly sending her sprawling across the row of seats. Joe caught her arm, steadying her. "Stay low and hold on to the seats as you move," the first officer instructed, already heading back toward the cockpit. They made their way forward, shuffling along the tilted aisle. Terrified faces looked up at them from every row. A child cried. Someone was praying loudly in a language Maylin didn't recognize. A flight attendant was comforting an elderly passenger who appeared to be having trouble breathing despite the oxygen mask. "What's actually happening?" Maylin asked the first officer when they reached the forward galley. "The whole truth." He glanced back at the passengers, then lowered his voice. "Multiple electrical failures. We've lost most of our instruments and half our hydraulics. The captain..." He hesitated. "The captain collapsed about 10 minutes ago. Possible heart attack or stroke. I've been flying solo." Maylin felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the plane's movements. This was worse than she'd imagined. Much worse. "I need experienced eyes," the first officer continued. "I can't monitor systems, communicate with any available ground stations, and fly this thing alone." He pushed open the cockpit door. Inside, the scene was chaos. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panels. Alarms chirped insistently. The captain lay slumped in his seat, his face gray, an oxygen mask fitted loosely over his mouth and nose. A flight attendant knelt beside him, monitoring his pulse. "He's stable, but unresponsive," the flight attendant reported. "Blood pressure's dangerously high." The first officer slid into his seat, hands immediately moving across the controls. "This is First Officer Chen. I've brought assistance." Joe moved to the captain's seat, checking the man's condition before carefully moving him. The flight attendant helped transfer the unconscious captain to a makeshift bed they'd created on the floor of the cockpit. "Take him to the crew rest area," Officer Chen ordered. "Keep him on oxygen." As they carried the captain out, Joe took his place in the left seat. His hands moved naturally across the controls, decades of muscle memory kicking in despite his retirement. "I'm not current on this exact model," he warned, "but the basics are the same." "What about me?" Maylin asked, still standing in the doorway. What do you need me to do? Officer Chen pointed to the jump seat directly behind them. Monitor those system displays. Tell us anything unusual, especially hydraulics, electrical, and engine performance. Mei Lin strapped herself in, hands shaking as she focused on the screens. Numbers, diagrams, warning indicators. It was overwhelming. But beneath the fear, her engineering mind began to work, sorting important information from noise, recognizing patterns in the chaos. The right engine is operating at 62% capacity, she reported. Left engine is compensating, running at 118% of normal output. That's not sustainable. Joe nodded without looking back. How long until burnout at that rate? Mei Lin did quick calculations. 20 minutes, maybe less. Officer Chen's hands tightened on the controls. We don't have a choice. We've lost too much altitude to reach Midway. We need to prepare for a water landing. Water landing. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mei Lin had read the statistics on ocean ditchings during her aerospace studies. They weren't good. Current position? Joe asked, voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. About 800 miles northeast of Midway. Middle of nowhere. Officer Chen's voice cracked slightly. We've been trying to send distress signals, but communications are compromised. I don't know if anything's getting through. Mei Lin studied the warning, lights trying to make sense of the cascading failures. Something wasn't adding up. Individual systems were failing in a sequence that seemed almost coordinated. These shouldn't all be failing at once, she said, thinking aloud. Modern aircraft have redundant systems specifically to prevent this kind of cascade. Joe glanced back briefly. That's true in theory, but when one critical system goes, No, Mei Lin interrupted, her fear momentarily forgotten as her analytical mind kicked into high gear. Look at the error codes. The electrical system, hydraulics, communications, they're all showing different types of failures, but they started failing within minutes of each other. That's not a cascade. That's multiple points of failure. Officer Chen frowned. What are you suggesting? Catastrophic structural damage? Not necessarily. Mei Lin's fingers flew across the system displays, pulling up diagnostic information. What if it's the monitoring system itself? What if we're getting false readings? The cockpit fell silent except for the constant drone of alarms. The AIMS, Joe said suddenly. The Airplane Information Management System, if it's corrupted, it could be reporting failures that aren't actually happening, Mei Lin finished, creating phantom problems. Officer Chen looked skeptical. That doesn't explain the physical symptoms, the vibrations, the power fluctuations. Actually, it might, Mei Lin countered. If the system is sending incorrect data to the engine controls, it could cause them to behave erratically, adjusting for problems that don't exist. She pointed to one of the screens. Look here. The temperature sensors in the right engine are reporting numbers that should have caused a complete shutdown, but the engine is still running. Inconsistently, yes, but running. So what do we do? Officer Chen asked, a hint of hope creeping into his voice for the first time. We can't just ignore the warnings. Mei Lin chewed her lip, thinking. We need to isolate the monitoring system from the control systems, break the feedback loop. That's not a standard procedure, Joe warned. This isn't a standard emergency, Mei Lin replied. She leaned forward, pointing to a specific section of the center console. There should be circuit breakers here that control the AIMS. If we can reset or bypass them, Joe nodded slowly. It's worth trying. Better than a water landing with compromised systems. Officer Chen looked between them. If you're wrong, we could lose what little control we have left. If we do nothing, Mei Lin said quietly, we'll definitely lose control when the left engine burns out from overcompensation. A moment of tense silence passed. Officer Chen nodded. Explain exactly what you want to do. For the next 5 minutes, Mei Lin outlined her theory in greater detail, identifying the specific circuit breakers they would need to manipulate and the potential consequences. Her hand still trembled, but her voice grew steadier as she explained the technical aspects. This was familiar territory, problem-solving, systems analysis, the same skills she used every day as an engineer, just with much higher stakes. It's essentially a hard reboot of the monitoring systems, she concluded. While maintaining manual control of the essential flight functions, Joe traced the circuit breaker panel with his finger. These three control the primary AIMS functions. These two are backups. We'd need to cycle them in sequence with precise timing. Can we do that while maintaining flight control? Officer Chen asked. One person can't, Joe admitted. We'd need all three of us working in perfect coordination. They looked at each other, the weight of 211 lives hanging on their decision. I say we try it, Joe said finally. I've been flying long enough to know when an aircraft is giving false information. This feels like that. Officer Chen took a deep breath. I agree. The alternative is... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Let's walk through it step by step. May, Lin said. Officer Chen keeps manual control of the aircraft. Joe, you'll handle the circuit breakers. I'll monitor the systems and guide the timing. They rehearsed the procedure twice, making sure everyone understood their role. Maylene felt a strange calm settle over her. The paralyzing fear had transformed into hyper-focus. For the first time since the engines had changed pitch, she felt a glimmer of hope. We should inform the cabin crew, Officer Chen said. They need to prepare the passengers. He keyed the intercom. Cabin crew, this is First Officer Chen. Prepare the cabin for possible turbulence. All passengers must remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Stand by for further instructions. That's it? Mei Lin asked after he released the button. No point causing panic, Joe explained. If this works, they'll never know how close we came. And if it doesn't? Neither man answered. Ready? Officer Chen asked, hands tight on the controls. Joe positioned himself at the circuit panel. Ready. Mei Lin took a deep breath, eyes fixed on the system displays. Begin on my mark. She waited until a specific pattern appeared in the engine data, the moment when the automated systems would be least actively engaged. 3, 2, 1. Mark. Joe's fingers moved with precision, pulling and resetting circuit breakers in the exact sequence they'd planned. The cockpit lights flickered. Several displays went dark. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if they had just made things worse. Maintaining altitude, Officer Chen reported, his voice strained. But I've lost all automated assistance. Keep it steady, Mei Lin urged, watching as numbers flashed across the rebooting systems. 20 seconds to full restart. Those 20 seconds stretched like hours. The ply. He shuddered. More alarms joined the cacophony, then gradually fell silent as systems came back online. Primary AIMS rebooting, Mei Lin reported. Secondary systems coming online, now. One by one, the displays lit up again. The engine noise, which had been erratic for hours, suddenly evened out. Engine performance stabilizing, Joe announced, scanning the readings. Right engine returning to normal parameters. Officer Chen's white-knuckled grip on the controls relaxed, slightly. Hydraulic pressure is normalizing. I've got assisted controls back. Mei Lin couldn't believe it was working. The plane's violent shuddering had subsided to a gentle vibration, then disappeared entirely. The warning lights began to clear. We did it, she whispered. Then louder, with growing excitement. We actually did it. Officer Chen allowed himself a brief smile. Don't celebrate yet. We still need to verify all systems and figure out our next steps. But there was no denying the improvement. The aircraft was flying smoothly again, responding properly to controls. The catastrophic failures reported by the monitoring system had vanished. What caused it? Officer Chen asked, as Joe helped him run through the checklist to verify each system. Mei Lin studied the diagnostic data now flowing across the screens. Corrupted sensor data. Looks like a software issue in the monitoring system, possibly triggered by a power surge or electromagnetic interference. I've never seen anything like it, Joe admitted. The system essentially gaslighted itself into an emergency. A knock at the cockpit door interrupted them. A flight attendant entered, her face showing a mixture of relief and confusion. What's happening? She asked. Everything suddenly got better. Officer Chen gestured to Mei Lin. Our passenger engineer figured out the problem. She saved us. The flight attendant looked at Mei Lin with astonishment. You did? How? Before Mei Lin could answer, a crackling voice came through the radio, the first communication they'd received in over an hour. Pacific Airlines Flight 437, this is U.S. Coast Guard Long Range Patrol. We received your emergency beacon. Do you copy? Officer Chen grabbed the radio. This is Pacific 437. We had multiple system failures but have restored functionality. Request immediate routing to nearest suitable airport. As Officer Chen coordinated with the Coast Guard Patrol, Joe turned to Mei Lin, his eyes filled with respect and gratitude. You were right, he said simply. Your engineering instincts saved everyone on this plane. Mei Lin felt tears well in her eyes, not from fear this time, but from a complex mixture of relief, pride, and lingering adrenaline. I just couldn't believe all those systems would fail simultaneously, she said. It didn't make engineering sense. Joe smiled. Sometimes the person most afraid of flying is exactly the person you want solving the problems. You cared enough to question everything. The mood in the cockpit had shifted dramatically. Just 15 minutes earlier, they'd been preparing for a catastrophic water landing. Now, Officer Chen was calmly discussing routing options with air traffic control, while Joe methodically checked each system to ensure the fix was holding. Mei Lin remained in the jump seat, still monitoring the displays. Her heart rate had finally begun to slow, but her mind was racing, examining and re-examining the problem they'd just solved. I don't understand how this happened in the first place, she said. These monitoring systems have multiple redundancies. Joe glanced back at her. That's what makes your catch so impressive. Even the automated safeguards missed it. Officer. Chen finished his radio communication and turned slightly in his seat. Coast Guard is relaying our position to Honolulu Control. They're recommending we divert to Wake Island. It's about 400 miles southwest of our current position. Can we make it that far? Mei Lin asked. Are we sure the systems won't fail again? Nothing's certain, Joe admitted, but all diagnostics are running clean now. And Wake Island has a proper runway, maintenance facilities. Much better than ditching in the ocean. Mei Lin nodded, trying to take comfort in that. She was still struggling to process what had just happened, how quickly the situation had escalated and then resolved, how close they'd all come to disaster. A thought suddenly struck her. The passengers, they must be terrified. No one's told them what's happening. Officer Chen nodded. You're right. We need to make an announcement. He looked between Joe and Mei Lin. Who should do it? You're the ranking officer, Joe pointed out. Yes, but I can't leave the controls. Not yet. He gave Mei Lin an appraising look. How would you feel about addressing the cabin? Me? Mei Lin's eyes widened. Why would they listen to me? Because you just saved everyone on this plane, Joe said simply. And sometimes people need to hear good news from someone who isn't crew. It feels more authentic, less like damage control. Mei Lin hesitated. The thought of speaking to over 200 frightened people made her stomach clench. But then she remembered the faces she'd seen while making her way to the cockpit. The fear. The uncertainty. Okay, she said finally. What should I tell them? The truth, Officer Chen replied. Well, a simplified version. They deserve to know what happened and that we're diverting to Wake Island as a precaution. Joe helped her prepare what to say, and after reviewing it with Officer Chen, Mei Lin took a deep breath and reached for the cabin intercom. Hello, everyone. This is Mei Lin Chen, one of the passengers on today's flight. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I'm speaking to you from the cockpit, where I've been helping the flight crew address the technical issues we experienced. I want to let you know that the situation has been resolved. We identified a problem with the plane's monitoring system that was giving false readings and causing the turbulence and power fluctuations you experienced. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Captain Wong experienced a medical issue and is being cared for by our flight attendants. First Officer Chen and a former pilot who was traveling as a passenger are now flying the plane. We've changed our flight path and will be landing at Wake Island in approximately 1 hour as a precautionary measure. This is standard procedure, to have the aircraft fully inspected before continuing to Taipei. Another pause. I know the past hour has been frightening. I was scared too. But I want you to know that the aircraft is now functioning normally, and we are in communication with air traffic control. The flight attendants will be coming through the cabin shortly to check on everyone. Thank you for your calm and cooperation during this difficult situation. She put the handset down, exhaling slowly. Well done, Joe said with an approving nod. From the cabin came sounds of relief, a smattering of applause, voices talking excitedly, even some laughter. The tension that had gripped the plane was beginning to dissolve. A flight attendant appeared at the cockpit door. That announcement was perfect, she said to Mei Lin. People are calming down, but they have questions, lots of questions. Like what? Mei Lin asked. Like how a passenger ended up fixing the plane, the flight attendant replied with a smile. You're quite the celebrity back there now. Mei Lin felt her cheeks flush. I just recognized a pattern. Joe and Officer Chen did the actual flying. Team effort, Joe corrected. We all played our parts. Officer Chen looked over his shoulder. The chief flight attendant should prepare the passengers for landing at Wake. It's about 50 minutes out. And have someone check if there's medical personnel on board who can continue monitoring the captain. The flight attendant nodded and disappeared back into the cabin. For the next half hour, the cockpit settled into a calm rhythm of routine checks and course adjustments. Joe explained what they were doing to Mei Lin, pointing out features of the navigational system and showing her how the flight management computer calculated their optimal route. You'd have made a good pilot, he observed as she quickly grasped each concept. I don't think so, Mei Lin replied. I like having both feet on the ground. Says the woman who just performed emergency troubleshooting at 35,000 feet, Joe said, with a chuckle. A knock at the door interrupted them. The businesswoman from the aisle seat entered, looking somewhat sheepish. Excuse me, she said. The flight attendant said it was okay to deliver this. She handed a folded piece of paper to Mei Lin. It's from everyone in the cabin. Puzzled, Mei Lin unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten note signed by dozens of passengers. Thank you for your quick thinking and bravery. We are grateful to be alive. Your fellow passengers on Flight 437. Mei Lin stared at the paper, feeling a lump form in her throat. The businesswoman cleared her throat awkwardly. I just wanted to apologize for how I reacted when you were called to the cockpit. I thought... She trailed off. It's okay, Mei Lin assured her. It did seem crazy at the time. Well, thank you, the woman said simply before returning to the cabin. Mei Lin carefully folded the note and tucked it into her pocket, unexpectedly moved by the gesture. First fan mail? Joe asked with a smile. Before she could answer, Officer Wu Shen spoke up. Wake Island Control has cleared us for approach. We'll be beginning our descent in about 10 minutes. As they prepared for landing, Mei Lin found herself looking at the cockpit with new eyes. The complex array of instruments and controls no longer seemed intimidating, but fascinating. Each display, each switch, each indicator light served a specific purpose in the intricate dance of forces that kept the massive aircraft aloft. Can I ask you something personal? She said to Joe as Officer Chen communicated with the control tower. Of course. Were you scared? Back when everything was failing? Joe considered the question. Yes, he answered honestly. But fear sharpens focus if you don't let it paralyze you. I've found that the best pilots aren't the ones who feel no fear. They're the ones who acknowledge it and work through it. Mei Lin nodded thoughtfully. I've been afraid of flying my whole adult life, even before my uncle's accident. But today you faced that fear head on, Joe finished for her, and discovered something about yourself in the process. Wake, Island Control has given us landing clearance, Officer Chen announced. Visibility is good. Winds at 6 knots from the southeast. Runway is clear. Through the cockpit window, Mei Lin could see the island coming into view. A tiny speck of land in the vast expanse of blue ocean. The runway looked impossibly small from this height, a slender gray line etched into the tropical landscape. Ready for landing? Officer Chen asked. more as a check-in than an actual question. "Ready," Joe confirmed, hands poised over the controls, on his side ready to assist if needed. Maylin gripped the edges of her seat as the plane began its final descent. Despite everything that had happened, or perhaps because of it, she felt oddly calm. The familiar anxiety that had plagued her during takeoff was still there, but it had transformed into something manageable, almost respectful. A healthy awareness of the risks rather than a crippling fear. The plane's nose dipped slightly as they approached the runway. Maylin could see palm trees swaying in the breeze, tiny vehicles positioned near the small terminal building, a fire truck standing ready, standard procedure for any unscheduled landing. 1,000 feet, Joe called out, reading from the altimeter. Landing gear down and locked, Officer Chen responded, his movements smooth and precise. 500 feet. Maylin held her breath as the runway rushed up to meet them. Despite the circumstances, it looked like a textbook approach, stable, controlled, perfect. 200. She could see individual palm fronds now, the texture of the runway surface, people standing outside the terminal building. 100. The ground proximity warning sounded its automated call-out. 50, 40, 30. Maylin closed her eyes for the final seconds, feeling the subtle shifts in the aircraft's attitude as Officer Chen aligned it perfectly with the runway. The tires chirped as they touched down, followed by the roar of the thrust reversers as Officer Chen brought the plane to a controlled stop. Maylin exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Wake Island," Officer Chen announced over the intercom. "Local time is 2:17 p.m. Please remain seated until we have taxied to our final position and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." As the plane rolled slowly toward the small terminal, Maylin looked out at the tropical island. It wasn't their intended destination, but right now, it looked like paradise. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now comes the boring part," Joe said with a smile. "Reports, inspections, interviews. The airline will send another aircraft for the passengers while this one gets a thorough examination. Will they find what caused the sensor malfunction?" Officer Chen nodded. "The flight data recorder captured everything. The maintenance team will analyze it, figure out exactly what went wrong. And the captain? Medical team is standing by," Officer Chen said. "They'll assess him first thing. Heart attacks are surprisingly common among pilots, unfortunately. Stress of the job." As the plane came to its final stop, Joe turned to Maylin. "You know, there's something poetic about all this. You avoided flying because of your uncle's accident, yet you ended up preventing what could have been a similar tragedy." Maylin hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. There was a strange symmetry to it. "I guess sometimes we have to face our fears, to overcome them," she said. "Exactly." Joe smiled warmly. "And sometimes the thing we're most afraid of is exactly the thing we're meant to confront." The seatbelt sign dinged off. Through the cockpit door, they could hear passengers beginning to move about the cabin, the relief in their voices palpable. "Ready to go back out there?" Officer Chen asked. "They'll all want to thank you." Maylin hesitated, suddenly shy at the thought of facing so many grateful strangers. "Actually, is it okay if I stay here a bit longer? I'd like to see the shutdown procedures, learn more about how everything works." Joe and Officer Chen exchanged amused glances. "Absolutely," Officer Chen said. "Though I warn you, once you start finding this stuff interesting, there's no going back. Next thing you know, you'll be taking flying lessons." Maylin laughed, but didn't dismiss the idea outright. For the first time in years, she found herself curious about aviation again, wanting to understand more about the intricate dance of mechanics, physics, and human skill that kept these massive machines in the air. As Officer Chen began explaining the shutdown checklist, Maylin realized something profound had shifted within her. The fear that had defined so much of her life hadn't disappeared, but she had proven to herself that she could function despite it, even use it as fuel for hyper-focused problem-solving. "You know," she said quietly, almost to herself, "I think my uncle would be proud." Joe heard her and nodded. "I have no doubt about that," he said. "No doubt at all." The next 12 hours on Wake Island were a blur of activity. As soon as the passengers disembarked, medical teams rushed aboard to attend to Captain Wang. He was conscious by then, groggy but stable. The paramedics whisked him away to the island's small medical facility for further evaluation. Meanwhile, airline representatives, who happened to be on the island for a training exercise, quickly mobilized to assist the stranded passengers. They transformed the tiny terminal building into a makeshift processing center, arranging accommodations at the island's only hotel and a nearby military barracks. Mei Lin found herself separated from the other passengers almost immediately. Officials from the airline's safety division wanted to debrief her, Joe and Officer Chen, while the events were still fresh in their minds. They were led to a small conference room where 3 serious-looking men and a woman in airline uniforms waited with recording equipment and laptops. "Please understand, this isn't an investigation," the woman, who introduced herself as Director Huang, explained. "We just need to document exactly what happened for our safety procedures. Your actions likely saved over 200 lives today, although." The next 3 hours they recounted every detail, from Mei Lin's first notice of the unusual engine sound to the moment they landed safely on Wake Island. The safety team asked dozens of questions, particularly about the system reset procedure they'd improvised. "I've never heard of anyone trying that during an actual flight emergency," one of the men admitted, looking impressed. "The risk was enormous." "The risk of doing nothing was worse," Mei Lin pointed out. Director Huang nodded thoughtfully. "Your background in aerospace engineering gave you insights our standard protocols don't cover. We may need to reevaluate some of our emergency procedures based on what happened today." When they finally finished, the sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Mei Lin stood outside the terminal building, watching the technicians swarming over Flight 437, their flashlights creating a dance of light around the aircraft. Joe appeared beside her carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Mei Lin took a sip before answering. "I'm not sure, it still doesn't feel real." "I know what you mean. After my first emergency landing as a pilot, I felt the same way, like I was watching myself in a movie." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sunset. "They've arranged another aircraft," Joe said eventually. "Should arrive tomorrow morning from Honolulu. We'll be in Taipei by tomorrow night." Mei Lin nodded, surprised to find herself not dreading the prospect of another flight. "How's the captain?" "Stable. They think it was a minor stroke brought on by stress. They're keeping him for observation, but the prognosis is good." A hotel shuttle van pulled up nearby. The driver called out that it was the last trip to the hotel for the night. "We should get some rest," Joe suggested. "It's been quite a day." As they rode to the hotel, packed in with other passengers from the flight, Mei Lin noticed how people looked at her, with a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and curiosity. It made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. The hotel was small but clean, a low-slung building surrounded by palm trees and flowering shrubs. With so many unexpected guests, everyone had to share rooms. Mei Lin found herself paired with an elderly woman named Mrs. Li, who had been traveling to Taipei to visit her new grandchild. "I prayed when the oxygen mask came down," Mrs. Li told her as they settled into their room. "I thought I would never see my grandbaby. Then you spoke on the announcement, and I felt hope again. Thank you." Mei Lin didn't know how to respond to such heartfelt gratitude. "I just noticed a pattern," she said modestly. "Anyone with my training might have done the same." Mrs. Li shook her head firmly. "No, not anyone. It takes courage to speak up when everyone else is following procedure. To trust your own mind." Sleep came surprisingly easily to Mei Lin that night, her body and mind exhausted from the day's events. She dreamed of flying, not in a plane but soaring through the air herself, free and unafraid. She awoke to sunshine streaming through the window blinds and the distant sound of waves. For a moment, she forgot where she was, thinking she had already arrived at her grandmother's seaside home in Taipei. Then reality rushed back. Mrs. Li was already up, dressed and packing her few belongings. They've announced the replacement aircraft will land at noon, she informed Mei Lin. Breakfast is being served in the lobby. The hotel had transformed its small restaurant to accommodate the influx of guests. As Mei Lin entered, conversation briefly halted and then resumed with increased energy. Several people smiled or nodded at her. A young family waved her over to join their table. My kids want to meet the woman who saved the plane, the father explained with an apologetic smile. If you don't mind. His children, a boy around 8 and a girl perhaps 10, looked at her with wide eyes. Are you a secret agent? The boy asked immediately. Mei Lin laughed. No, just an engineer. I design bridges and buildings. But you fixed the plane, the girl insisted. I helped identify the problem, Mei Lin clarified. The pilots did the actual flying. As she ate breakfast, more passengers stopped by to express their thanks. Their stories affected her deeply. The businessman rushing home for his son's birthday, the college student traveling abroad for the first time, the nurse returning from a medical conference. Each one had plans, hopes, people waiting for them. Each life connected to so many others. The weight of what might have happened pressed on her. After breakfast, Mei Lin found Joe sitting on the hotel's small patio, gazing out at the ocean. I just got off the phone with the airline's chief maintenance engineer, he said as she sat down beside him. They found the problem. What was it? A software bug in the monitoring system, just like you suspected, under very specific conditions. A power fluctuation combined with certain atmospheric conditions. It could create false readings that would cascade through related systems. They'd never seen it manifest before because the conditions are so rare. Mei Lin felt a strange mixture of vindication and horror. So if we hadn't reset the system, the plane would have continued responding to phantom problems until we lost control, Joe confirmed. Your catch saved everyone aboard. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications. They're sending a senior tech team from the manufacturer to Wake Island today, Joe continued. They'll issue an emergency software patch to every aircraft with that system. You've potentially saved more lives beyond our flight. A shuttle arrived to take passengers to the airfield around 11 a.m. The replacement aircraft, a slightly older model than their original plane but fully serviced and inspected, was already waiting on the runway when they arrived. As passengers began boarding, an airline representative approached Mei Lin and Joe. We'd like to offer you seats in first class for the remainder of your journey, she said. It's the least we can do. Joe accepted gratefully, but Mei Lin hesitated. Actually, would it be possible to visit the cockpit before we take off? Just for a minute? The request was unusual, but given the circumstances, quickly arranged. Officer Chen was already in the cockpit, running through pre-flight checks with a new captain who had flown in with the replacement aircraft. Mei Lin, Officer Chen greeted her warmly. Come to supervise our work? She smiled. Just wanted to say thank you and goodbye. The thanks go to you, he replied seriously. What you did yesterday was extraordinary. The new captain, an older man with salt and pepper hair, stood to shake her hand. The whole airline is talking about you, he said. Not many engineers could have spotted that pattern under pressure. Mei Lin felt her cheeks warm at the praise. I actually had a favor to ask, she said. Would it be okay if I sat in the jump seat again? Just for takeoff? The pilots exchanged surprised glances. You want to be in the cockpit after everything that happened? Officer Chen asked. Mei Lin nodded. I need to see it again. The normal version. To replace the scary memories with better ones. Understanding dawned in their eyes. The captain checked his watch. We can arrange that. We take off in 30 minutes. True to his word, when the boarding was complete and the pre-flight checks finished, a flight attendant escorted Mei Lin back to the cockpit. The jump seat felt familiar now as she buckled herself in. Ready for a boring, routine takeoff? The captain asked with a smile. Absolutely, Mei Lin replied. This time, as the engines powered up and the plane raced down the runway, Mei Lin kept her eyes open. She watched the instruments, the precise movements of the pilot's hands, felt the exact moment when the wheels left the ground. There was still fear, a healthy respect for the forces involved, but it no longer controlled her. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Mei Lin felt a sense of closure. She thanked the pilots and returned to her first-class seat, where Joe was waiting. "How was it?" he asked. "Different," she said thoughtfully. "Better." The rest of the flight to Taipei passed without incident. Mei-Lin even managed to doze off for a few hours, something she would have thought impossible just 2 days earlier. When they landed in Taipei, a small crowd of reporters had somehow gotten wind of their story. Camera flashes greeted them as they exited customs. "Ms. Chen, how did you save Flight 437? Were you scared? Will you be working with the airline to improve their systems?" Mei-Lin froze, overwhelmed by the attention. Joe placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Ms. Chen needs to reach her family," he told the reporters firmly. "She's had a long journey." A young woman pushed through the crowd. "Mei-Lin," she called, waving frantically. "My cousin," Mei-Lin explained to Joe, relieved to see a familiar face. "I should go." Joe nodded. "Of course, but listen. If you ever reconsider your career path, if bridges and buildings start to seem a little too stationary, I know several people in aviation safety who would be very interested in your insights." Mei-Lin smiled. "I'll think about it." They exchanged contact information before Mei-Lin joined her cousin, who immediately pulled her into a tight hug. "We heard what happened," her cousin exclaimed. "It's all over the news. Grandma is telling everyone her granddaughter is a hero." Mei-Lin groaned, but couldn't suppress a smile. "How is she?" "Much better since hearing you were safe. She's eager to see you." As they drove through the night-lit streets of Taipei, Mei-Lin gazed up at the sky, tracking the blinking lights of passing aircraft. Each one carried hundreds of people, each with their own stories, their own purposes, their own loved ones waiting. 2 days ago, she'd boarded a plane focused only on her fear. Now she understood something deeper about those fears, that sometimes, facing them revealed strength she never knew she had. When they arrived at her grandmother's apartment, the elderly woman was waiting at the door despite the late hour. She pulled Mei-Lin into a fierce embrace. "My brave girl," she whispered in Mandarin. "I always knew you were special." Mei-Lin returned the hug, feeling the frail body that had once seemed so strong to her as a child. She had traveled halfway across the world to say goodbye, fearing it might be their last meeting. But now, holding her grandmother close, she felt a powerful certainty that this was just one of many visits to come. After all, the journey no longer seemed so daunting.